So now that we have my caveats out of the way, my plan is to start by addressing some barriers to effective discussion about systemic racism. Then I will be giving a primer, if you will, of some significant issues in our criminal justice system as they pertain to race. And like I said, my goal is that this will springboard into further learning and discussion. Already ahead of the game, haven't had a tech failure yet. All right. So, barriers to effective communication about systemic racism. If you take nothing else from what I'm about to say right now, please remember this. While intent certainly matters, intent is not all that matters when it comes to racism. Racism is about much more than intent. It is about disparate impact as well. I'll discuss that in a little bit more depth later. But in my opinion, there are 3 myths that disrupt productive discussion about systemic racism. And myth number 1 is that all discussions of racism are about individual racism. I created this little graphic, thank you very much. Racism is like an iceberg. The bulk of it hides below the surface of what we see. When most of us hear the term racism, we are thinking of intentionally discriminatory individual or interpersonal racism. This is your prototypical white supremacist type of racism, but even individual or interpersonal racism exists on a scale. So we need to be very careful in checking our assumptions and being aware. A white supremacist is a very extreme version, but lower on the scale of individual racism, we might see a white woman who clutches her purse a little bit tighter when she walks by a black man as opposed to a white man, because she's just a little bit more afraid without even necessarily thinking about or knowing why. On the far other end of that scale, and kind of what we would view as the least extreme, you might have very well-intentioned but race-based assumptions that generalize black people as a whole, such as, oh, they're probably really good at dancing or at sports, or you must love fried chicken, okay? These on their own do not seem harmful, but we have to be aware that we are still making vast generalizations about a group of people based on race. Okay, so that's the tip of our iceberg. But underneath that, we have, 90% or whatever of an iceberg is what's below the surface. Now we have our systemic or institutional racism. A general description of systemic racism are policies, procedures, and practices of different organizations and institutions, whether individually or collectively, that work to the benefit of white people and the detriment of people of color. So, for example, if we are talking about the Black Lives Matter movement in the context of police interactions, this is a discussion of institutional racism, typically. It is absolutely critical to understand that there does not need to be intentional discrimination here. The best analogy I can give is, I'm sure in high school or elementary school we've heard that all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. In this analogy, racism is the rectangle and intentional discrimination is the square. The rest of that rectangle is disparate impact. Now, what is interesting to note is that disparate impact is often descended from intentional discrimination. So, for example, in this presentation, I will be saying that the mass incarceration system is descended from racial slavery. But the nexus may go so far back that it's hard to trace, and it perhaps may go unrecognized. Going back to the police example, an officer or the group of officers involved may not feel any racial malice. The officers might not even all be white. But when I tell you that black people are approximately 5 times more likely to be stopped and searched without cause than white people, that is a disparate impact. 5 times more likely to be stopped and searched without cause. And whether or not that disparate impact is intentional by the stopper and searcher, it is a form of institutional racism. Now, when you look at the cumulative impact of systemic racism in various contexts, such as education, as has already been one of the speakers, housing, healthcare, voting, criminal justice, you get a snowball effect that impacts nearly every aspect of life. The reason I think it is so important for me to take time to speak about these distinctions is because otherwise when I get up here and I'm talking about racism, it's going to sound very much like I'm saying, hello, white people, you are all bad racists. Not only to anybody who can physically see me at this moment, would that be very hypocritical, it's unproductive. We do, yes, need to feel a sense of responsibility as humans to create change. And I would argue that especially those of us who have historically been privileged need to feel that responsibility. But we do not need to waste valuable energy wringing our hands and self-flagellating instead of moving forward and creating that change. The worst possible outcome here is stagnancy or regression. Myth number 2. White people are also impacted by injustices in the criminal justice system, so these are not actually issues of racism. The best analogy I could come up with to describe this is that is like saying that breast cancer is not a women's issue because men get breast cancer too. Yes, some people who suffer from what I will call racist policies, and I think are provably racist policies, may be white. There is a hugely disparate impact. I was talking to my mom this morning when I was driving up, and she's on the Bluetooth, and we're talking, and I noticed that I was driving by a police car, and I said, "Oh, I better slow down, I don't want to get a ticket." I was not necessarily speeding, but I better slow down, I don't want to get a ticket. And I'm sure, my mom was probably thinking, "Oh, Katie, don't get a ticket, don't slow down, you don't want to pay that money, and also, why are you driving so fast? You're going to hurt yourself, you're going to crash into something." My mother, in that situation, still had a form of privilege, and I want to talk to you about that. When I say she had privilege, I don't mean it's, we're insulated from everything. We are so lucky. We are so, blessed in every respect and don't deserve what we have. My mother was privileged because in that list of fears, she did not have to think, "Katie, don't get pulled over. You might be killed by an officer." She did not have to worry about that. Neither did I. That is not to say that there are not white women who are killed by officers. That is not to say that every black man pulled over is harmed by an officer. But it is astronomically more likely. And my mother doesn't have to worry about that. Many mothers of black sons do. I want to point out a few ways that I can show racism within the system right off the bat. African American youth are 9 times, and Latino youth are 4 times more likely than a white youth to receive an adult prison sentence for the same crime. Other controls have been adjusted for. These are all talking about children being charged as adults for a crime. African American youth are 9 times more likely to be seen as more culpable, less likely to be rehabilitated, less likely to be redeemed. That is what we talk about when we talk about charging children as adults as opposed to children. That is institutional racism. The people making these decisions may not even know that this is happening and that they are perpetuating racism. It is racism nonetheless. Disparate impact. Another thing I do want to mention, because again, lawyer with statistics, the big joke is, you can make a statistic say whatever you want to. I have tried very hard to include statistics where other factors have been controlled for. So, for example, in this situation, it is the same crime. We're not talking about a black child who killed someone versus a white child who jaywalked. Same crime, disparate impact. Okay. The single most reliable predictor of whether someone will be sentenced to death is the race of the victim when all else is accounted for. That's according to Amnesty International. I will cite that one since it's close to my work and I don't want to get into Katie speaking in her professional capacity. African Americans make up approximately 50% of all homicide victims, despite being approximately 13% of the population. However, you'll see here 77% of executions since 1977, which was shortly after the death penalty was revised, 77% of executions were for killing a white victim. Disparate impact. Black people and white people have approximately the same usage rates of marijuana. Statistically, black individuals are like point something, more likely to use than white people. Not much. Very small amount, essentially the same. Yet they are nearly 4 times more likely than whites to be arrested for marijuana possession. The consequences matter. Disparate treatment. Okay, this is probably going to be a little bit hard to see at a distance. So what I really want to point out here is this is the projected lifetime likelihood of incarceration for people born in 2001. Okay. A white man, 1 in 17 will be incarcerated at some point. This could be jail, this could be arrest. This doesn't necessarily mean hard time, but this could be arrest. 1 in 3 black men are projected. 1 in 3. This is something that I think even the most skeptical individuals, even the most jaded about the system, may be shocked by. 1 in 3. I'd do a quick count of how many people are in the audience right now, but I'd like you to take a look and, if we were a group of black men, how many of us would be incarcerated at some point? The numbers are not quite as stark for women, but we still have an extremely disparate treatment. 1 in over 100 for women, 1 in 111 approximately, 1 in 18 for black women. Incarceration of black women is very quickly rising. It's kind of a new group. A lot of the literature, for example, Michelle Alexander's fantastic book, The New Jim Crow, focuses primarily on black men incarcerated for low-level crimes, particularly drug crimes. She wrote a very interesting caveat about the impact on black women as well. I would highly recommend reading that. Black people are over 3 times as likely to be shot and killed by the police as white people. Some studies place this rate at far higher, but I'm trying to be very conservative with my estimates here. I think credibility is very important and not hyperbolizing, because I think the second we start hyperbolizing in this way, as a lawyer, I feel that we lose credibility. So please understand that this is a conservative estimate. A study that I found that was conducted by students at Harvard showed that police accounted for more than 1 in 12 of all homicides of adult men between 2012 and 2018. And if present rates hold, so again, this is allowing for some variation, but if present rates hold, 1 in 1,000 Black men can expect to die of police violence. To everyone, wherever you are, thinking that 1 in 1,000, we've just been talking about 1 in 3, 1 in 1,000 doesn't sound that much. Think about signing up for surgery. Are you going to trust 1 in 1,000? A vaccine, perhaps, 1 in 1,000 side effects. A lot of people have been concerned about that. These statistics matter. Myth number 3, this is too overwhelming for me to fix, and I'm just going to offend somebody anyway. All I can say to this one is no. Trust me, I have nearly exclusively studied criminal justice. I've done a couple of other things in my studies. I have exclusively practiced criminal law as an attorney, so I very much understand the feeling of overwhelm and futility. But it is like any other seemingly insurmountable problem. Just keep swimming. Take one step. It's too overwhelming is not a reason not to keep trying to make it a little better. Okay. I felt that this was an interesting lens given current world events. I was at a conference once in which we attended a session where racism was examined as though it is a virus. And as we probably know by now about viruses, as they evolve, they must remain alive. In order to do that, they may become less blatantly severe, less extreme, and also more contagious. It is how a virus survives. With criminal justice, that might not be what we think of as antebellum slavery. Picture mass incarceration, picture the prison. It doesn't necessarily evoke the same visceral reaction. But I would challenge us to look at this as an evolution and see that it is not an eradication, it is just a progression and evolution of racial oppression. To illustrate, I do not actually know the source of this picture, but during my law school internship, I frequented Louisiana State Penitentiary, AKA Angola, and every time I was on that property, I saw that. A scene very much like that, often with more people. I cannot recall seeing anyone who was not a person of color in the group of men working the fields. It's not to say there wasn't one somewhere, but it was overwhelmingly Black. Every guard I saw was white, pointing guns while Black men worked the fields. Again, it is a broader conversation to talk about jobs in prison, consequences for not working. We can make 5,000 other sessions to discuss these nuances, and I am more than happy to because I have many thoughts. But I want you to understand the echoes. These men are frequently forced to work. When they get to prison, they are evaluated by a doctor, and unless they are pretty close to death's door, they are usually deemed fit to work. Many of them sent to the fields. The property that this prison is on used to be a plantation. They're working these same fields. If they do not work, if they say they are sick one day when they are not deemed to be sick, I mean, think of all the times that we call into work that we're not dying. That happens. They face harsh punishment, such as solitary confinement. And in return for their work, which need I remind you, their work does not it does not alleviate any burden of the cost of their housing, as we put it. So let me just remind you of that. In return for their work, they may be paid 2 to 4 cents an hour approximately. At least that's what it was the last time I checked, for hard labor in the fields. Now, for context, a 15-minute phone call from prison may cost upwards of $5. Want to calculate how many hours of work it takes to call your loved ones for 15 minutes? Again, I am not saying that this is exactly the same as antebellum slavery. We can get into exactly how direct the connection is. That is something I think is worth exploring, because I would posit it's a very strong descendancy, but you cannot deny the echoes. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The 13th Amendment was supposed to be this beautiful, beautiful thing. We are the land of the free. We are no longer going to hold slaves. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. That sounds like the land of the free. Except that's not all it says. Except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Shall have been duly convicted. There is no other requirement. Again, I want to trace the history so that you can see what I'm talking about when I'm discussing this descendancy. Slavery ended at approximately 1865. Very soon after, you had newly freed slaves walking off of plantations because they were no longer compelled to be there. And you start getting the Black Codes. The Black Codes, I will not deign to say what was in someone's mind who was perpetuating the Black Code. I'm not them, but I will give you facts. These are people who had previously owned slaves, seen Black individuals as property, and lost a source of work. Suddenly, it is illegal for Black people to be out after certain times of the day, to be vagrant or without a job, and several other things. It was not illegal for white people. What happened to people who violated these Black Codes? They were arrested, and we have a practice that I'm sure you've heard of called convict leasing. Eventually, the Black Codes are repealed, but we still have the Jim Crow era. We have segregation, we have impediments to voting, to education, to advancement. Then, once again, we feel like we're making some progress. We get to the Civil Rights era. Beautiful decisions there. I mean, if you reread Brown versus Board of Education, the language in there is sweeping. It is aspirational. I'm sorry, unfortunate word to stutter on. Aspirational. It is showing what we can be, except we don't still apply that in the criminal justice system. The 13th Amendment still says what it says. And around the same time, we start seeing the rise of mass incarceration. I would like to read for you, and I do not want this to be political, because what I want to make very clear that individuals on both sides of the partisan aisle have played phenomenal roles in perpetuating criminal injustice and what I would say are immoral conditions. But I am going to read this quote, direct quote from John Ehrlichman, Nixon's advisor, because this is not an accusation, these are his own words. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. It became a political advantage at this point to be seen as tougher on crime than the other guy. So we see both sides of the aisle ramping up because there has become a strategy, Lee Atwater described this as the Southern strategy, of finding buzzwords to use in lieu of other words. For example, where politicians prior to the civil rights movement might have freely used the N-word, now that wasn't helpful to their campaign and their rise to power. So instead, other words started being used. They started talking about forced busing, states' rights, and then later, drugs, criminal. Criminal right now is a very racially charged buzzword. It, once again, does not only apply to people of color, but it is a very charged buzzword, and it is often a stand-in for a racial issue. Again, we see this in George Bush and Dukakis's election with the Willie Horton ad, just a little bit of history, Bill Clinton's 1994 crime bill, and that's just a little bit of the history. This, I think it's really important to have real-world examples. This is Calvin Duncan, who I had the absolute privilege of, he is my friend. He is formerly incarcerated. He is now in law school. He is a Soros Fellow. And he described growing up in New Orleans where all of the kids in his neighborhood had a nursery rhyme. And it was, you had to rhyme with your age what was going to get you sent to Angola. Okay. So now that I've kind of gotten the history out of the way, I want to give a few discussions of topics. School to prison pipeline. I imagine that this was covered in some ways in Dr. Roberson's presentation. Some of the systemic failings in the schools that have led to disparate treatment and discipline of white and black students. I will give you another statistic, and that's that black students make up less than 1/3 of the public school population, but they are 3.5 times more likely to be suspended for nonviolent offenses such as disruptive behavior or violating a dress code. And they are approximately 70% more likely to be referred to law enforcement as white students. Okay. Now what happens when someone is arrested? A lot of the wrongful conviction work deals with people who have been convicted and later exonerated. That is extreme. It merits a lot of discussion. It's very important. But it is more likely in our day-to-day life that we will be dealing with an issue of pretrial detention, pretrial decisions with consequences that last far longer. Approximately 3/4 of incarcerated individuals in local jails have not yet been convicted of their crimes. 3/4 of them. There have not been a ton of recent studies about bail, but a conservative estimate is that black felony defendants are approximately 25% more likely to be held pretrial without any option for bail than similarly situated white defendants. Why does this matter so much? If any one of us are incarcerated, I've got a little plant in the audience, and it's my mom. But she's promised to answer honestly. Mom, you're arrested. Sorry. What's your first concern?
My family.
Your family. And how can you take care of your family? What's your biggest concern in terms of taking care of your family now?
Food, clothing, shelter, all the basics and nurturing that goes with it.
So what do you need to do?
I need to get out of jail.
You need to get out of jail. My public defender friends who deal with pretrial issues as opposed to post-conviction often say that one of the first things out of their new client's mouth is, when am I getting out of here? It is an immediate short-term consequence. It is necessary, it is vital. It is also another issue where there is a disparate impact on communities of color. And it's not necessarily visually race-based, and again, this is not my area of expertise. Your other speakers will tell you why and how individuals of color typically have fewer resources, less wealth, less job security, less support systems in terms of childcare, transportation, that can be relied upon for those issues. Other speakers will cover that, so for now, please just accept that as something that has been demonstrated. If we as privileged individuals perhaps have a job that enables us X number of paid days of vacation, sick time, flex time, we might not lose our job if we're in jail for a couple of days. If you have a less flexible job, you might not be that lucky. That time waiting for your initial appearance might be all it takes for you to lose your job. Now, how do you get out? Typically, if you're allowed bail, you have to pay. The purpose of bail was meant to be to protect the community, to keep the community safe. So, for example, if you have an extremely mentally ill and violent person who is being held, bail would be to protect the community from what might happen if he is in society during the pretrial time. Bail is also used to ensure that somebody actually shows up for court. That is all. That is all the purpose of bail. It is not meant to be punitive. It is not meant to be monetary. Thank you. However, that is what bail has become. One study found that for violent crimes, bail amounts are, on average, approximately $7,000 higher for Black defendants than white defendants. For minor crimes, bail amounts were approximately $10,000 higher for Black defendants than white defendants. And for drug crimes, bail amounts were $13,000 higher for Black defendants than white defendants. Disparate impact. So, what happens if you either are not able to make bail, so you are currently in jail awaiting your trial? Who knows how long that will take? The criminal justice system is notoriously backlogged. Or what if you are released but under harsh pretrial detention monitoring, ankle bracelets? Or what happens if you are facing a crime with the possibility of a very long sentence that might be a mandatory minimum? There might be no judicial discretion. If you go to trial and you are convicted of this crime, you will serve X amount of years. What is your next thought? Maybe I'll take a plea. This is a tough one because the right to a trial is a constitutional right, but often individuals who exercise that right are punished for it. There will be offers made. Approximately 95% of criminal charges are resolved with a plea rather than a trial. This is, again, an approximation. In other words, if there were no plea bargains, the system would choke. So what happens is there is an offer made. If you are facing, one of the slides that is coming up talks about average sentence for a federal drug charge in 2012 was about 16 years. If you accepted a plea prior to trial, that was a little over 5 years. That's a huge gamble. And the people who are most vulnerable to needing to take that plea because they face a higher likelihood of conviction, people of color. Another issue that your other speakers can get to is that poverty is correlated with racism. On average, Black individuals make cents on the dollar to what white individuals make. They might not be able to hire Jeffrey Feiger, he's a local example, or Johnny Cochran when he was alive. I'm obviously a proponent of public defenders. I think that in many cases they are heroes. However, they're notoriously overworked. For a case that needs to be resolved quickly, you might not have the luxury of somebody fancy. The other issue is that if you are to go to court as a minority, odds are the people in that courtroom will not look like you. Your lawyer will probably be white because there is a historic underrepresentation of people of color in the professional arenas. The judge is especially likely to be white because most judges come from being lawyers originally. If you are a juror, you may well be white. Racial issues in juries are rampant and they are understudied. There is a case that says you are allowed, Batson versus Kentucky, I'll get to the nitty-gritty. You cannot strike jurors based on race and gender, but all you have to do to get around that is to give a pretextually race-neutral reason. I didn't like the way this person looked at me. Now, once again, that can work both ways. Technically, you could have a Black defendant wanting white jurors struck, but historically, there is a racial disparity. So you've gone to court and now you face some certain sentencing issues. One of those that I'd like to talk about is mandatory minimums. Mandatory minimums are extremely problematic. They are exactly what they sound like. It is where there is no discretion allowed in sentencing. You are convicted of X crime, you get X time. No discretion. It does not matter what your circumstances are. It doesn't matter what incredible mitigation you may have. It doesn't matter what you can show. The judge's hands are tied. There are so many anecdotes of judges crying in the courtrooms as they hand down these sentences because they don't even want to incarcerate for that long. They are in tears, but their hands are tied. One of these in federal sentencing was the disparity, and still is, between crack and powder cocaine. And just kind of a quick primer on this. Crack has historically been viewed as a drug that urban African Americans use. Powder cocaine has historically been viewed as a drug that suburban Caucasians use. They are both cocaine. If you had, prior to the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, if you had 1 gram of crack cocaine, which just by basic physics, crack cocaine a little bit heavier than powder cocaine to begin with. If you had 1 gram of crack cocaine, your sentence would be the equivalent of what you would have needed 100 grams of powder cocaine to get. Disparate impact. After the Fair Sentencing Act, we have gotten closer to fairness, but I would say we are still far from fair. It is now, instead of a 100-to-1 disparity, an 18-to-1 disparity. We also have 3 strikes laws, which are exactly what they sound like, 3 strikes and you're out. The rhetoric and design was purportedly to keep violent offenders off the streets. It's always called a reaction to violent and serious felonies. But let me give you some examples of what have been found to constitute violent or serious felonies in certain states. Unarmed purse snatching, stealing $1 in loose change from a parked car, sale of drugs to a minor, attempting to break into a soup kitchen, stealing a bicycle, possessing less than half a gram of drugs, and stealing shampoo. 3 convictions, life imprisonment. And studies show that 13 times more Black people were incarcerated under the 3 strikes law than white people. Some other sentencing disparities, just a couple other statistics. I'm going to make this pretty brief because I don't want everyone's eyes to glaze over with the statistics. But for federally charged crimes with sentencing discretion, so these are not mandatory minimums, these are where judges have discretion, sentences are on average nearly 20% longer for Black men than for white men convicted of similar crimes. And this disparity is still present when past criminal histories are accounted for, other demographic issues. This is a controlled disparity. According to a study conducted within the past 10 years, although, as I said, Black people constitute approximately 13% of the population, they constitute over 56% of those serving life without parole sentences, and over 65% of those serving life without parole sentences for nonviolent offenses. 65% for 13% of the population. These disparities may be even more marked in certain southern states and the federal system, where over 70% of those serving life without parole sentences are Black. And now we're going to get to my favorite part, collateral consequences. I showed you Calvin a little while ago, and I want to tell you something brief about his story. My parents were first introduced to Calvin when I came back from my internship and I wanted him to speak at my law school. And I came home and I said, and this is important because this is kind of a what can I do, how can I make this problem less overwhelming, what can I contribute story. Hey guys, I really want Calvin to speak at my school, and I live in a tiny little 1-bedroom in Ann Arbor because I'm a law student, and I need a place for Calvin to stay because our group doesn't have a lot of funding, so we can't put him up in a hotel, so he can stay in my bedroom at your house, right? Oh, by the way, my dad's not going to be home, so he'll just be with my mom because I'm going to be in Ann Arbor. I've got something else I have to do tonight. And, oh, by the way, he served 28 and a half years for murder. Now, on the face of that statement, I think many people might make an assumption. Ultimately, he stayed in my bedroom at my parents' house, and they all got along swimmingly. My dad came home a little bit early. They went out for brunch. Okay, on paper, that looks like one thing. But what happens when I tell you that Calvin was wrongfully convicted due to a mistaken cross-racial eyewitness identification. In fact, prior to his trial, the prosecution knew that Calvin could not have committed this crime because Calvin had actually been in jail that same day. Real good alibi. He served 28 and a half years. Once you are convicted and imprisoned, it becomes exceptionally hard to get access to your files. You know what you have to do to get your files, aside from jump through a lot of hoops? You have to pay. Calvin educated himself. He became what was known as a jailhouse lawyer. He helped several other prisoners obtain release during his time at Angola. And then he got the prosecutor's file and knew he had a claim. Now, if you're that prosecutor, I'm guessing you're probably going to think it's not in your best interest for this to come to light. So Calvin was offered a deal. Either he could pursue his claim to be fully exonerated and have his conviction overturned, which would take unclear how long. He's already been there 28 and a half years before he could get his hands on one file. So how much longer will it take to get exonerated? Or he could enter what was called an Alfred Plea, which is where you admit that there was enough evidence to convict you, and he could be released on time served. For anyone that ever wonders why innocent people do not contest guilt or admit to things they didn't do, that's why. Calvin took the latter option and was released. I'm giving you this story because Calvin's told it many times, and so I feel like I can tell this story here, but also because it does have a happy ending. However, what is the first thing Calvin's going to be concerned with when he gets out? Mom? She said revenge, which I think is a fair answer, but Calvin, being the wonderful human being he is, he was not at all interested in that. He does not even harbor anger. He's said it many times. It's incredible. However, no. What else aside from revenge, Mom? Job. Except there's a problem. Because on many, many, many job applications, there is a box that says, "Have you ever been convicted of a felony?" And Calvin has to check yes. And anyone else in a similar situation has to check yes. Because it doesn't matter the circumstances in these situations. It doesn't matter that he didn't do it. Have you been convicted of a felony? Okay, so Calvin was given about $10 and a bus ticket when he got out. So what else is he probably worried about? Where's he going to live? And he's been in prison for a long time, as many people in these situations have, so family may be long gone. Any relationships that existed prior to prison statistically are likely to have imploded. Maybe Calvin or someone in his shoes knew somebody from their time in prison who was out and doing well, maybe. Except there's a problem there too, because conditions are often that you cannot associate with other known felons. If the person in Calvin's shoes is lucky enough to have a family member, perhaps, that would be willing to put him up, you might also have a problem because, also in this rental agreement, I'm not allowed to have a felon in my home. If the person in this situation has been convicted, even wrongly, of a sex offense, we have a whole host of problems that could be another presentation. Can't live near a school, can't live near a park. It has become so much harder. And we look at recidivism and we look at things like these 3 strikes laws, And I think there are probably some people out there saying, well, three times. Look how hard after one involvement with the justice system it is to rebuild your life. And this story is extreme. This is 28 and a half years in prison. But this can happen even without a conviction. If you are held pre-trial indefinitely, and you've lost your job and perhaps lost a relationship, and the stigma of having been incarcerated is with you, these are real-world consequences. And I don't have a ton of data on collateral consequences, the numbers, honestly, because it's something I've just anecdotally seen so many times. I didn't feel the same need to have meticulous numbers for you. I'm happy to look them up if you're curious. But this, like everything else in the criminal justice system, there is a disparate impact on people of color. So when we talk about privilege and we talk about systemic racism in the criminal justice system, we're not saying that white people get fair shakes all the time. We're not saying a white person can't get caught up in the same situation. We're talking about the privilege that most of us have not had to worry quite so much about this, and most of us did not, for as grotesque as some nursery rhymes can be, did not grow up singing in a rhyme about what was going to send us to prison. Thank you.
This is 6 feet, right?
I think so.
That was great. Very illustrative and deeply depressing at times. But I think it's important to get the facts out there, and especially the way you presented it was very helpful. So thank you. Quick reminder: if you have index cards, please write any questions on them. You can hand them to Bethany right here. If you don't have them, they're at the folding table at the front here. And if you'd like them, obviously. And then if you're online, please, write in the comments box. And I see a few over here. I jotted down some as well. So I think we'll just start from the top, if that's all right with you.
Yeah.
And I will say that Katie is wildly informed about this, but of course she doesn't have all the answers. I don't think there's anyone in the world who does. So, I'm sure you're going to answer to the best of your ability.
I promise to say I don't know if I don't know.
So, anyways, let's start off with this first one. Actually, I'll come back to that. This is a good one. So your last one of your last examples there about collateral consequences. So that little checkbox where you have to check whether you've been convicted or you're a former felon. I saw recently another example of this was in some states you can't vote if you're formerly convicted. Florida did away with that. How can we get rid of that box, or how can we get rid of voting restrictions or other restrictions on, former incarceration? Do you have any thoughts on that?
My opinion at this point would be legislate, make this an issue that you care about. And one thing that I'm so glad this was a question, because I forgot to mention it in my collateral consequences that I got so fired up about, but this is an area where we, with our privilege, have an enormous responsibility to work towards change, because the people who have lived these issues and these injustices often are not allowed to vote or will not be elected for office. They're not going to be in the positions of power to make the changes. So that is something we need to lift up the voices. We need to be contacting our representatives. We need to be In some cases, such as Florida, I hate to give such a simplistic answer as reach for your wallets, but we need to be, if these restrictions are going to remain in place, that perhaps you have to pay a certain number of fees and fines from your court case in order to get your voting rights restored, we need to be contributing that money. We need to be helping with that. If we are very serious about making this change, that will be the quickest way to fix it. So I would say legislation and tangible resource contribution.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. And tangentially with this is actually something I had asked about, and then we have another question on it, but cash bail. So that's been kind of a hot topic in Lansing here, and at times when politicians are feeling brave, bring it up. But do you have any thoughts on the cash bail system, and maybe you can explain that too for some people in the audience?
I would prefer, I think that's a very nuanced topic, and that is actually one of the ones that I feel least prepared to address in depth because my cases never get bail, so it's not something I've ever had to learn a lot about. I would be very happy to put something together, but off the top of my head, I would rather not go into depth.
That's completely fine.
Yeah,
Thank you for your honesty.
But I'll put something together.
So for those, cash bail is it's an issue where you essentially put up some money, saying you're going to hang out at home or elsewhere and not get in trouble while you're waiting for trial. Here in Michigan, there is a cash bail system. As Katie mentioned, and as many of us have heard in other presentations and will continue to hear, particularly on the wealth cog, people of color are just in worse financial straits than white folks, and so often are disparately impacted by the cash bail system. This one's a good one. So, I think, and I was thinking about this while you were talking, we liken this to antebellum slavery, or if we talk about, say, the disparate impact of black folks in the education system, but here we have someone who did something wrong, right? So there are the wrongfully convicted who, like your friend Calvin, who get exonerated or end up taking time served. But I find when I talk to some friends or even loved ones, they say, well, this person did something wrong. So how do we kind of combat that and say, well, yeah, but there's a little more there?
This was the question I was really hoping I wasn't going to get because it is tricky.
Sorry.
No, but I do have an answer. I think that throughout this history, there has always been a reason to other the people we are viewing as marginalized. In antebellum slavery times, it was perhaps a view that black individuals were less human than white individuals. That was a view that some people held at that time, and that was used as justification, or that white people were more refined and black people were more savage, and so they needed to be under the control of slavery. There is always a reason to other someone, and I would wager that at the time that reason is in its heyday, it feels compelling or reasonable, much like saying, okay, someone incarcerated and convicted has done something wrong. I would challenge us to look at what we want our criminal justice system to be. Do we want it, and especially saying this here in a place of worship, this is a place that believes in redemption. This is a place that believes that we can be better than what we were, and that we have something to offer. Do we want our prison system to reflect that? Or do we want our prison system to just cast people away? Do we believe people are worse than the worst thing they've ever done? There's always a reason to other. And as I said, this evolutionary kind of virus view of racism This is how it survives, because we can distance from racism because now we can say criminal. And I think we just need to very deeply reflect. I don't have an easy solution, but I think we need to reflect on what it means to say someone is a criminal, the fact that someone has done something wrong. And we need to be honest about the ways we have done something wrong. And I promise I'll wrap up with this one more thing. Brian Stevenson, who wrote Just Mercy, had given a talk on the death penalty in Germany. And somebody in the audience stood up and said, well, of course we could not execute here. We could not have the death penalty in Germany with our history. Can you imagine if we started building gas chambers, particularly if this was disproportionately impacting Jewish people? We were disproportionately executing Jewish people with our history. And I think we need to look at our history and really figure out what we are comfortable implementing for people that, whether we bear this intent currently or not, have historically been oppressed.
I think that's really well said. And you know, this kind of strikes me in your example, but the stealing the shampoo, for instance, or maybe what I've heard called driving while black. But oftentimes you'll have a police officer, cite a motor vehicle code or use like a very outdated or just kind of nothing law to justify, this fact that 1 in 3 black men are going to end up being incarcerated. Have you, read anything on that, or do you have any thoughts on how often that might happen, anecdotally or otherwise?
I don't know how often it happens, but what I do know is that the strongest predictor of whether you will be arrested and become involved with the criminal justice system is how much police surveillance you encounter, policing happens around you. So for example, at my parents' house, and at my house for that matter, I don't frequently notice police on street corners. There's not one at every corner. So if I haven't turned my lights on, or I don't signal, or I speed when I'm coming home, or I weave, that's not going to be noticed to the extent that it may be noticed in a higher policed area. Those areas, my theme of the night, disparate impact, those areas are disproportionately areas of color. So these pretextual stops, or what we would call pretextual stops, are a common occurrence, and they are a very frequent source of charges. And another thing that I think we with privilege should be doing is exercising our own rights in the event that we are stopped by police. I had this conversation with my mom when we were watching People versus OJ. I made some comment about, this is why you shouldn't talk to the police without an attorney. And she said, but why? I said, don't let them search your car. Don't let them search anything. Well, why? I don't have anything to hide. And I think the first example I gave was, well, remember how riled up I used to get you when you were a teenager, and I'd just poke at you until you said something, and I'd be, Well, imagine what a grown-up prosecutor can do. The other thing is, yes, we can talk about, it is possible that police plant evidence, it is, whatever. But these are rights, these are constitutional rights, and if we are not exercising them, when we have no particular extra reason to fear the police, we most of us looking around the room just visually are privileged in that respect. If we are not exercising our rights when we know we have nothing to hide, then it is easier for the police to see a marginalized person exercising their rights and say, well, they must have something to hide, so I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to find a way to search. We need to be exercising those rights.
So, as part of this whole Matthew 25 series, and I think the church's broader mission to dismantle structural racism, we're always looking for ways to help, right? I think, the intent of our committee was to, bring about discussion, respectful discussion, and to bring people together instead of apart. And I think that we're largely achieving that goal. But outside of that, tangibly speaking, you mentioned money, and just kind of talking about it. Are there other organizations, I guess, that are already taking this on that we can volunteer with or go knock doors? Oh, maybe after COVID we can go knock doors, or we can give money to them or volunteer with them. Have you heard of any organizations like that?
There are a number of organizations doing amazing work. What I would recommend is looking for an organization that specializes in reentry. There are some prisons where you can go in and give training to people who have been incarcerated for a while about life skills. One example is imagine if you've been incarcerated for 30 years, what it's like to now come out and have iPhones and all of these. So I would recommend, if you're looking to volunteer, I would say an organization that deals with reentry. Again, I would legislate. In terms of places to donate money, there's a real ideological split on kind of where we should be putting those funds. And so I don't feel comfortable making a specific recommendation. For educational purposes, though, I would probably recommend looking at the Southern Center for Human Rights, the Equal Justice Initiative, organizations like that can teach and will have, often when specific issues come up that are kind of hot button issues at the time, there will be specific ways to help.
Thank you very much. It appears that we've gotten to the end of our comments, so I want to thank you again, Katie. We have a wide variety of media on the website under what we're calling our toolkits section. That's the whole, learn after you've listened. One of them, Katie mentioned, The New Jim Crow. It's a great book. I'll also direct you to our free library in the hallway that has that book along with other books on structural racism. But Katie's also offered to provide some additional materials. So, keep checking that toolkit because it'll probably get revised over the next week or so. And, there will be some other great materials on there if you've already, seen 13th and read The New Jim Crow and gone through what we have up there. So again, Katie, I just want to thank you, for presenting this. I'm sure this took a long time, and traveling all the way up here from Kentucky and being able to talk to us has been tremendous. So thank you for that. I'm just going to stick with this one because if I combine the mics, I'm going to cause a whole mess. So, so again, for those of you who are listening online, please do check out that website. You can probably do it while you're watching right now. For those here in person, check it when you get home because there's just some fantastic information on there. That is the Learn portion of our educational series. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to have our Lean In. So for those of you who have participated in these before, you're familiar with the format. It's via Zoom, and it is very informal. Show up in a hoodie, show up in your pajamas, don't put the camera on, have a glass of wine, whatever. But really it's meant to be a more open venue where we have more collaboration between people who are participating and also myself and other members from the Matthew 25 committee. We can talk a little more openly about what this means to us, anecdotes we may have, and importantly, what we can do going forward, both as a church and as a broader community to assist with this. So that will be January 7th at 7 p.m. Our next Listen event will be February 17th. It's the same format as tonight's. This one's going to focus on housing, and this one is going to be fantastic as well. It's going to be 2 people talking. The first is Regina Cannon from C4 Innovations. Her organization works to support equitable access to recovery, wellness, and housing stability. She'll be joined by Kimber Bishop Yankee from Kids Empowered. They support kids in our local community, so strongly recommend you attend that one as well. With that, I'll close the evening.
Thank Tom for making all this possible.
Yes. I thank you, John, for making me not regret that after I stopped talking. But Tom, thank you so much. Tom's our audiovisual guy.